Now, just like we've done with some of our previous examples, let's compare this file with our previous examples so we can see what the differences are. So I'm going to go back to the resource pack directory, and I'm going to open up the 8th step in my file comparison tool. I'll move it to the left side, and then the 9th step, which is our current one here, I'm going to put on the right side, and I'm going to click compare. Now if we scroll down, we'll see there's a change right here. I'm going to keep scrolling. We have some bigger changes right here. I'm going to keep scrolling. We have some additional changes here. And if I keep scrolling, we have some additional ones near the bottom. And finally here, right there. So in all, we have 12 changes. Now let's scroll up to the top and take a look at these differences line by line. So this first item is in the people display function, where we're creating the HTML table that displays our users along with the delete link. And in this case, we're adding an edit link too. So if you see here, we have an A link, test.php action equals edit form. So this is a new action. And then we're also passing the username, row username. And then the text for the link is edit. Okay, I'm going to scroll over to the left. So now we'll see an edit link next to every record. And as I scroll down here, we see we have the add form function. Here's where that function begins here. Now, like I mentioned before, the strategy that we're going to use here is to leverage the same form both for the add action and for the edit action. But to do that, we need to add some extra logic to determine whether we're going to be using an edit form or an add form. So even though it adds a little complexity here at the beginning, what it will do is make this much easier to extend. So whenever we add an input to one form, we're going to end up adding an input to the other form just automatically. So our first difference is when we call this form, we're actually going to take a parameter here for username. So if this is going to be an edit form, we need to know what record to pull out and populate the form with. So that's why we pass the username to it. If this is empty, we're going to set the username to null. And so we'll know then throughout here that if the username is null, that we're actually working with an add form instead of an edit form. Now these next parts I'm going to describe briefly what they do, and then we'll jump over to the editor to take a closer look at what the actual script is doing. So notice we're adding some logic here, and then we're starting to build our form. You see that the gray over here aligns with the gray over here. If we scroll down, you can kind of see these lined up with one another. The actual form itself is pretty similar. We have a couple of blue parts which indicate a difference. We have edit text up here, we have username input here, our submit button might be a little bit different, and then we have this hidden input here. Now besides that, if we scroll over to the right, you'll see here that in our ternary operator where we were checking to see if the user actually submitted something for an input, for our default, instead of something empty, now if we scroll over, you can see over here that we have an empty item as an alternative if the post variable didn't exist. In a new form, what we're doing is pulling out something from a row variable. And this is the record from the database that aligns with the username that got passed to this function. Okay, so I'm going to scroll back over here to the left. As we look down, you see that now we're using request instead of get for the action. That's because we may have an action as part of a get variable or as part of a post variable, and we also change that here. And then we have some new cases. We have edit form, which is actually going to do the same thing as an add form, but notice that these cases are right next to one another. This is the first time that you've probably seen two cases that perform the same action. So the idea here is that we might get an action that says edit form, and what we want to do is do everything that we would do for an add form action. And this is how you can do that. The output is a little bit different here because we're using the add form function, just like we did in our previous example, but we need to check to see whether we have a username to give to add form if we're going to use an edit form. So that's what we do there. And then we have the same sort of double case for edit and add. Notice over here we just have case add. And if we scroll down, you see that the bulk of the code here stays the same with the validation requests. We're doing something a little bit different here with the case of checking the uniqueness of the username, because in the case of an edit form, the user isn't going to submit a username to validate. So we only run this validation if the action equals add. And then if we scroll down here a little bit more, we've done a little change here to change the name of a variable to make it a little bit more descriptive. Now, just to anchor ourselves, if we scroll up, this is actually in our add case when we submit the form. So this is checking to see what the request action is, and if it's add or edit, then we're running through this code. Next, we're going to either insert the data into the database, or we're going to update an existing record. Again, at this point, we've passed all of our validation tests, and we've put together the data for the query. Now, because the structure of the query is going to be different for an insert statement versus a update statement, then we're putting them together in a bit of a different way each time. And this is something that we'll look at in the editor when we have a little bit more space to take a look here. In this final change, what we're doing is just adding a break statement to the end of this, and this is more of a fix to our code than a functionality change.